Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang. Episode 17. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ-LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you and my beastly feline companion Wolfgang. So Wolfus, what do you want to hear? A retrieved Reformation by O. Henry. A guard came to the prison shoe shop where Jimmy Valentine was assiduously stitching uppers and escorted him to the front office. There, the warden handed Jimmy his pardon, which had been signed that morning by the governor. Jimmy took it in a tired kind of way. He had served nearly 10 months of a 4-year sentence. He had expected to stay only about 3 months at the longest. When a man with as many friends on the outside as Jimmy Valentine had is received in the stir, well, it is hardly worthwhile to cut his hair. Now, Valentine, said the warden, you'll go out in the morning, so brace up and make a man of yourself. You're not a bad fellow at heart. Stop cracking safes and just live straight, will you?
Me? Said Jimmy in surprise. Why, I never cracked the safe in my whole life, huh?
Oh, no, laughed the warden. Of course not. Let's see now. Well, how was it you happened to get sent up on that Springfield job? Was it because you wouldn't provide an alibi for fear of compromising somebody in extremely high-tone society? Or was it simply a case of a mean old jury that had it in for you? It's always one or the other of those two for innocent victims such as yourself.
Why, me? Said Jimmy, still blankly virtuous. Why, warden, I was never in Springfield my whole life, huh?
Take him back, Cronin, smiled the warden. Fix him up with outgoing clothes, unlock him at 7 in the morning, and let him come to the bullpen. Better think over my advice, Valentine.
At 7:15 on the next morning, Jimmy stood in the warden's outer office. He had on a suit of villainously fitting ready-made clothes and a pair of the stiff, squeaky shoes that the state furnishes to its discharged compulsory guests. The clerk handed him a railroad ticket and the $5 bill, which the law expected him to rehabilitate himself into good citizenship and prosperity. The warden gave him a cigar and shook hands. Valentine 9762 was chronicled on the books. Pardoned by governor. And Mr. James Valentine walked out into the sunshine. Disregarding the song of the birds, the waving green trees, and the smell of flowers, Jimmy headed straight for a restaurant. There, he tasted the sweet joys of liberty in the shape of a broiled chicken and a bottle of white wine, followed by a cigar, a grade considerably better than the one the warden had given him. From there, he proceeded leisurely to the depot. He tossed a quarter into the hat of a blind man sitting by the door and boarded his train. 3 hours set him down in a little town near the state line. He went to the cafe of one Mike Dolan and shook hands with Mike, who was alone behind the bar. Hey, you're right. Sorry we couldn't make it sooner, Jimmy, my boy, said Mike, but we had that protest from Springfield to buck against, and the governor, well, he nearly balked. Are you feeling all right? Yeah, I'm feeling fine, said Jimmy. You got my key? He got his key, and he went upstairs, unlocking the door of a room at the rear. Everything was just as he had left it. There on the floor was still Ben Price's collar button that had been stolen from the eminent detective's shirt band when they overpowered Jimmy to arrest him. Ben Price is the detective. Keep that in mind. Pulling out from the wall a folding bed, Jimmy slid back a panel in the wall and dragged out a dust-covered suitcase. He opened this and gazed fondly at the finest set of burglar's tools in the East. It was a complete set made of specially tempered steel, the latest design in drills, punches, braces, and bits, jimmies, clamps, and augers, with 2 or 3 novelties invented by Jimmy himself, in which he took pride. Over $900 they had cost him to me, made at Smitty's, a place where they make such things for the profession. In half an hour, Jimmy went downstairs and through the cafe. He was now dressed in tasteful and well-fitting clothes and carried his dusted and clean suitcase in his hand. So you got anything going on there? Asked Mike genially. Me, said Jimmy in a puzzled tone. I don't understand. I'm representing the New York Amalgamated Short Snap Biscuit, Cracker, and Frazzled Wheat Company. What you think? This statement delighted Mike to such an extent that Jimmy had to take a seltzer and milk on the spot, because he never touched hard drinks. A week after the release of Valentine 9762, there was a neat job of a safe burglary done in Richmond, Indiana, with no clue to the author. A scant $800 was all that was secured. 2 weeks after that, a patented, improved burglar-proof safe in Logansport was opened like cheese to the tune of $1,500 currency, securities and silver untouched. That began to interest the rogue catchers. Then, an old-fashioned bank safe in Jefferson City became active and threw out of its crater an eruption of banknotes amounting to $5,000. The losses were now high enough to bring the matter into Inspector Ben Price's class of work. By comparing notes, a remarkable similarity in the methods of the burglaries was noticed. Ben Price investigated the scenes of the robberies and was heard to remark, "That's Dandy Jim Valentine's autograph. He's resumed business. Look at the combination knob. Jerked out as easily as pulling up a radish in wet weather. He's got the only clamps that can do it. And look how clean those tumblers were punched out. Jimmy never has to drill but one hole. Yeah, I know who this is. I guess I want Mr. Valentine. He'll do his bit next time without any short time or clemency foolishness." Well, Ben Price was very familiar with Jimmy's habits. He had learned them while working up the Springfield case. Long jumps, quick getaways, no Confederates, and a taste for good society. These ways helped Mr. Valentine to become noted as a successful dodger of retribution. It was given out that Ben Price had taken up the trail of the elusive cracksman, and other people with burglar-proof safes felt a little more at ease. One afternoon, Jimmy Valentine and his suitcase climbed out of the mail hack in Elmore, a little town 5 miles off the railroad down in the blackjack country of Arkansas. Jimmy, looking like an athletic young senior just home from college, went down to the board sidewalk toward the hotel. A young lady crossed the street, passed him at the corner, and entered a door, over which was the sign, "The Elmore Bank." Jimmy Valentine looked into her eyes, forgot what he was, and became another man. She lowered her eyes and colored slightly. Young men of Jimmy's style and looks were scarce in Elmore. Jimmy collared a boy that was loafing on the steps of the bank as if he were one of the stockholders and began to question him about the town, feeding him dimes at intervals. By and by, the young lady came out, looking royally unconscious of the young man with the suitcase, and went her way. "Isn't that young Miss Polly Simpson?" asked Jimmy with a specious guile. "Nah," said the boy. "She's Annabelle Adams. Her pa owns this bank. What'd you come to Elmore for? Is that a gold watch chain? I'm going to get a bulldog. You got any more dimes?" Jimmy went to the Planters Hotel, registered as Ralph D. Spencer, and engaged a room. So this is the first alias he's using. Jimmy Valentine, registered as Ralph D. Spencer. He leaned on the desk and declared his platform to the clerk. He said he had come to Elmore to look for a location and to go into business. How was the shoe business now in the town? He had thought of the shoe business. Was there an opening? The clerk was impressed by the clothes and manner of Jimmy. He himself was something of a patron of fashion to the thinly gilded youth of Elmore, but now he perceived his shortcomings. While trying to figure out Jimmy's manner of tying his four-in-a-hand tie, he cordially gave information. Yeah, there ought to be a good opening in the shoe line. There wasn't an exclusive shoe store in the place. Dry goods and general stores handled those. Business in all lines was fairly good. So, Mr. Spencer would decide to locate in Elmore. He would find it a pleasant town to live in, and the people there very sociable. Mr. Spencer thought he would stop over in a town a few days and just sort of look over the situation. No, the clerk needn't call the boy. He would carry up his own suitcase himself. It was rather heavy. Here we have the transition. Mr. Ralph Spencer, the phoenix that arose from Jimmy Valentine's ashes. Ashes left by the flame of a sudden and alterative attack of love. He remained in Elmore and prospered. He opened a shoe store and secured a good run of trade. So, Jimmy Valentine gets out of prison and changes his name and his life to become Mr. Ralph Spencer, shoe store salesman. Socially, he was also a success, and he made many friends. And he accomplished the wish of his heart. He met Miss Annabelle Adams and became more and more captivated by her charms. At the end of a year, the situation of Mr. Ralph Spencer was this. He had won the respect of the community. His shoe store was flourishing, and he and Annabelle were engaged to be married in 2 weeks. Mr. Adams, the typical plodding country banker, approved of Spencer. Annabelle's pride in him almost equaled her affection. He was as much at home in the family of Mr. Adams as that of Annabelle's married sister, as if he were already a member. One day, Jimmy, or Ralph, sat down in his room and wrote this letter, which he mailed to the safe address of one of his old friends in East St. Louis. Dear old pal, I want you to be at Sullivan's place in Little Rock next Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. I want you to wind up some small matters for me. And also, I want to make you a present of my kit of tools. I know you'll be glad to get them. You couldn't duplicate the lot for $1,000. Say, Billy, I quit the old business a year ago. I got a nice store. I'm making an honest living. And I'm going to marry the finest girl on earth 2 weeks from now. It's the only life, Billy. The straight one. I wouldn't touch $1 of another man's money now for $1 million. After I get married, I'm going to sell out and go west where there won't be so much danger of having old scores brought back up against me. I tell you, Billy, she's an angel. She believes in me. And I wouldn't do another crooked thing for the whole world. Be sure to be at Sully's. I gotta see you. I'll bring the tools with me. Your old friend, Jimmy Valentine. On the Monday night after Jimmy wrote this letter, Inspector Ben Price jogged unobtrusively into Elmore in a livery buggy. He lounged about town in his quiet way until he found out what he wanted to know. From the drugstore, across the street from Spencer's shoe store, he got a good look at Ralph D. Spencer. Gonna marry the banker's daughter, are you, Jimmy? Said Ben to himself. Well, I don't know. The next morning, Jimmy took breakfast at the Adamses. He was going to Little Rock that day, he said, to order his wedding suit and buy something nice for Annabelle. That would be the first time he had left town since he came to Elmore. It had been more than a year now since those last professional jabs, and he thought he could safely venture out. After breakfast, quite a family party went downtown together. Mr. Adams, Annabelle, Jimmy, Ralph, and Annabelle's married sister with her 2 little girls, aged 5 and 9. They came by the hotel where Jimmy/Ralph still boarded, and he ran up to his room and brought along his suitcase. Then they went on to the bank. There stood Jimmy's horse and buggy and Dolph Gibson, who was going to drive him over to the railroad station. All went inside the high, carved oak railings into the bank room, Jimmy included, for Mr. Adams's future son-in-law was welcomed anywhere. The clerks were pleased to be greeted by the good-looking, agreeable young man who was going to marry Miss Annabelle. Jimmy set his suitcase down. Annabelle, whose heart was bubbling with lively youth, put on Jimmy's hat and picked up the suitcase and, "Wouldn't I make a nice salesman?" said Annabelle. My, Ralph, how heavy this is. It feels like it's full of cold bricks. There's a lot of nickel-plated shoehorns in there, said Jimmy coolly. There, I'm gonna return them. See, I thought I'd save the express charges by just taking them up myself. I'm getting awfully economical. The Elmore Bank had just put in a new safe and vault. Mr. Adams was very proud of it and insisted on an inspection by everyone. The vault was a small one, but it had a new patented door. It fastened with 3 solid steel bolts thrown simultaneously with a single handle and had a time lock. Mr. Adams beamingly explained its workings to Mr. Spencer, who showed a courteous but not too intelligent interest. The 2 children, May and Agatha, were delighted by the shining metal and funny clock and knobs. While they were thus engaged, Ben Price sauntered in and leaned on his elbow, looking casually inside between the railings. He told the teller that he didn't want anything. He was just waiting for a man he knew. Suddenly there was a scream or two from the women and a commotion. Unperceived by the elders, May, the 9-year-old girl, in the spirit of play, had shut Agatha, the 5-year-old girl, inside the vault. She had then shot the bolts and turned the knob of the combination as she had seen Mr. Adams do. The old banker sprang to the handle and tugged at it for a moment. "The door can't be opened," he groaned. "The clock hasn't been wound, nor the combination set." Agatha's mother screamed again, just hysterically. "Hush, hush, hush, hush," said Mr. Adams, raising his trembling hand. I'll be quiet for a moment. Agatha, Agatha, he called as loudly as he could. Just listen to me." During the following silence, they could just hear the faint sound of the child wildly shrieking in the dark vault in a panic of terror. "My precious darling," wailed the mother. "She'll die of fright. Open the door. Just break it open. Can't you men do something?" "There isn't a man nearer than Little Rock who can open that door," said Mr. Adams in a shaky voice. "My God, Spencer, what shall we do? That child, she can't stand it long in there. There isn't enough air, and besides, she'll go into convulsions or something awful from fright." Agatha's mother, frantic now, beat the door of the vault with her hands. Somebody wildly suggested dynamite. Annabelle turned to Jimmy, her eyes large and full of anguish, but not yet despairing. To a woman, nothing seems quite impossible to the powers of the man she worships. "Can't you do something, Ralph? Just try, won't you?" He looked at her with a queer, soft smile on his lips and in his keen eyes. "Annabelle," he said, "give me that rose you're wearing, will you?" Hardly believing that she heard him right, she unpinned the bud from the bosom of her dress and placed it in his hand. Jimmy stuffed it into his vest pocket, threw off his coat, and pulled up his shirt sleeves. With that act, Ralph D. Spencer passed away, and Jimmy Valentine took his place. "Get away from the door, all of you," he commanded. He set a suitcase on the table and he opened it out flat. From that time on, he seemed to be unconscious of the presence of anyone else. He laid out the shining, queer implements swiftly and orderly, whistling softly to himself, as he always did when at work. In a deep silence and immovable, the others watched him as if under a spell. In a minute, Jimmy's pet drill was biting smoothly into the steel door. In 10 minutes, breaking his own record, he threw back the bolts and he opened the door. Agatha, cute little Agatha, almost collapsed, but she was safe and gathered into her mother's arms. Jimmy Valentine put on his coat and walked outside the railings toward the front door. As he went, he thought he heard a faraway voice that he once knew call out, "Ralph!" But he never hesitated. At the door, a big man stood somewhat in his way. Yeah. Hello, Ben," said Jimmy, still with his strange smile. Got around at last, have you? All right, let's go. I don't know that it makes much difference now. And then Ben Price acted rather strangely. Guess you're mistaken, Mr. Spencer, he said. I don't believe I recognize you. Your buggy's waiting for you, isn't it? And with that, Ben Price turned and strolled down the street, as did Ralph Spencer. Saki. His actual name was H. Monroe, and he passed in 1916, and I think I've described him on this show as being just painfully British. He wrote several books, but several of them are collections of short stories. And one of the books is called The Chronicles of Clovis from 1911. And I believe I've read a couple of things to you all from The Chronicles of Clovis so far, if memory serves. This is The Stampeding of Lady Bastable from The Chronicles of Clovis by Saki. It would be rather nice if you would put up Clovis for another 6 days while I go up north to the McGregors, said Mrs. Sangrel, sleepily across the breakfast table. It was her invariable plan to speak in a sleepy, comfortable voice whenever she was unusually keen about anything. It put people off their guard, you see, and they frequently fell in with her wishes before they had realized that she was really asking for anything. Lady Bastable, however, was not so easily taken unawares. Possibly, she knew that voice and what it betokened. At any rate, she knew Clovis. She frowned at a piece of toast and ate it very slowly, as though she wished to convey the impression that the process hurt her more than it hurt the toast, but no extension of hospitality on Clovis's behalf rose to her lips. It would be a great convenience to me, pursued Mrs. Sangrail, abandoning the careless tone. I particularly don't want to take him to the McGregors, and it will only be for 6 days. It will seem longer, said Lady Bastable dismally. The last time he stayed here for a week... I know, interrupted the other hastily, but that was nearly 2 years ago. He was younger then. But he hasn't improved, said her hostess. It's no use growing older if you only learn new ways of misbehaving yourself. Mrs. Sangrail was unable to argue the point. Since Clovis had reached the age of 17, she had never ceased to bewail his irrepressible waywardness to all her circle of acquaintances, and a polite skepticism would have greeted the slightest hint of a prospective reformation. She discarded the fruitless effort at cajolery and resorted to undisguised bribery. If you'll have him here for these 6 days, I'll cancel that outstanding bridge account. It was only for 49 shillings, but Lady Bastable loved shillings with a great, strong love. To lose money at bridge and not to have to pay it was one of those rare expenses which gave the card table a glamour in her eyes which it could never otherwise have possessed. Mrs. Sangrail was almost equally devoted to her card winnings, but the prospect of conveniently warehousing her offspring for 6 days and, incidentally, saving his railway fare to the north reconciled her to the sacrifice. When Clovis made a belated appearance at the breakfast table, the bargain had been struck. "Just think," said Mrs. Sangril sleepily. "Lady Bastable has been very kind and asked you to stay on here while I go to the McGregors." Clovis said suitable things in a highly unsuitable manner, and proceeded to make punitive expeditions among the breakfast dishes with a scowl on his face that would have driven the purr out of a peace conference. The arrangement that had been concluded behind his back was doubly distasteful to him. In the first place, he particularly wanted to teach the McGregor boys, who could well afford the knowledge, how to play poker patience. Secondly, the Bastable catering was of the kind that is classified as rude plenty, which Clovis translated as plenty that gives rise to rude remarks. Watching him from behind ostentatiously sleepy lids, his mother realized, in the light of long experience, that any rejoicing over the success of her maneuver would be distinctly premature. It was one thing to fit Clovis into a convenient niche of the domestic jigsaw puzzle. It was quite another matter to get him to stay there. Lady Bastable always liked to retire in state to the morning room immediately after breakfast and spend a quiet hour in skimming through the papers. They were there, so she might as well get her money's worth out of them. Politics did not greatly interest her, but she was obsessed with a favorite foreboding that one of these days would be a great social upheaval in which everybody would be killed by everybody else. "It will come sooner than we think," she would observe darkly. A mathematical expert of exceptionally high powers would have been puzzled to work out the approximate date from the slender and confusing groundwork which this assertion afforded. On this particular morning, the sight of Lady Bastable enthroned among her papers gave Clovis the hint towards which his mind had been groping all breakfast time. His mother had gone upstairs to supervise packing operations, and he was alone on the ground floor with his hostess and the servants. The latter were key to the situation. Bursting wildly into the kitchen quarters, Clovis screamed a frantic, though strictly non-committal summons. "Poor Lady Bastable! In the morning room! Oh, quick, quick!" The next moment, the butler, cook, page boy, 2 or 3 maids, and a gardener who had happened to be in one of the outer kitchens were following in a hot scurry after Clovis as he headed back for the morning room. Lady Bastable was roused from the world of newspaper lore by hearing a Japanese screen in the hall go down with a crash. Then the door leading from the hall flew open, and her young guest tore madly through the room, shrieked at her in passing, "The Jacquerie!" and "They're on us!" and dashed like an escaping hawk out through the French window. Well, a scared mob of servants burst in on his heels, the gardener still clutching the sickle which he had been trimming the hedges with, and the impetus of their headlong haste carried them slipping and sliding over the smooth parquet flooring toward the chair where their mistress sat in panic-stricken amazement. If she had had a moment granted her for reflection, she would have behaved, as she afterward explained, with considerable dignity. It was probably the sickle which decided her, but Anyway, she followed the lead that Clovis had given her through the French window and ran well and far across the lawn before the eyes of her astonished retainers. Lost dignity is not a possession which can be restored at a moment's notice, and both Lady Bastable and the butler found the process of returning to normal conditions almost as painful as a slow recovery from drowning. Jacquerie, even if carried out with the most respectful of intentions, cannot fail to leave some traces of embarrassment behind it. A Jacquerie, for those that are not looking up the footnotes in real time, a Jacquerie is sort of like a peasant uprising, but primarily, if not entirely, consisting of one's own servants. Not a mutiny, but an uprising of the house servants. So therefore, a Jacquerie, even if carried out with the most respectful of intentions, cannot fail to leave some traces of embarrassment behind it. By lunchtime, however, decorum had reasserted itself with enhanced vigor as a natural rebound from its recent overthrow, and the meal was served in a frigid stateliness that might have been framed on a Byzantine model. Halfway through its duration, Mrs. Sangrail was solemnly presented with an envelope lying on a silver platter. It contained a check for 49 shillings. The McGregor boys learned how to play poker patience after all. They could afford to. Something that's been nearer and dearer to my heart for all of my adult life. I first recall reading Henry David Thoreau when I was a teenager. And at one point when I was, 19, 20, I made a solo road trip to the East Coast. I was going to a stage combat workshop just to work with swords and various medieval and Renaissance weaponry for 2 weeks in Boston. And on my way back, on my way back, I just had to drop by Massachusetts and spend just an extra afternoon in New England. And at some point in this, I went on what felt like a religious pilgrimage because I visited Walden Pond for the first and so far only time in my entire life. I had read it cover to cover many times before, and even more times since. So on this particular occasion, I went and I just reveled in walking the same paths as my transcendentalist hero, and walked around the pond, and just because it was the stupid flights of youth, I reached down and I drank out of it, which I'm kind of amazed in retrospect I didn't get ridiculously sick. I knew it was a bad idea at the time, and I thought, you know what? Whatever microbes invade me and sicken me, I'm going to remember this sip of water as a baptism. And all right, without any further prelude, this is an excerpt from Walden Pond, from a chapter called Winter Animals. When the ponds were firmly frozen, they afforded not only new and shorter routes to many points, but new views from their surfaces of the familiar landscape around them. When I crossed Flint's Pond, after it was covered with snow, though I had often paddled about and skated over it, it was so unexpectedly wide. In Goose Pond, a colony of muskrats dwelt and raised their homes high above the ice, though none could be seen abroad when I crossed it. Walden, being like the rest unusually bare of snow, or with only shallow and interrupted drifts on it, was my yard, where I could walk freely when the snow was nearly 2 feet deep elsewhere. There, far from the village street, I slid and skated, as in a vast moose yard, well-trodden, overhung by oak woods and solemn pines bent down with snow or bristling with icicles. For sounds in winter night, and often in winter days, I heard the forlorn but melodious note of a hooting owl, the very language of Walden Wood, and quite familiar to me at last, though I never saw the big bird while it was making it. I seldom opened my door in a winter evening without hearing it. One night in the beginning of winter, before the pond froze over about 9 o'clock, I was startled by the loud honking of a goose, and stepping to the door, heard the sound of their wings like a tempest in the woods as they flew low over my house. They passed over the pond toward Fairhaven, seemingly deterred by my light from settling, their leader honking all the while with a regular beat. Suddenly, an unmistakable owl from very near me, with the most harsh and tremendous voice I ever heard from any inhabitant of the woods, responded at regular intervals to the goose, as if determined to expose and disgrace this intruder from Hudson's Bay by exhibiting a greater volume of voice. It was one of the most thrilling discords I have ever heard. I also heard the whooping of the ice in the pond, as if it were restless in its bed and would turn over and had dreams. Sometimes I heard the foxes as they ranged over the snow crust in moonlit nights in search of a partridge or other game, barking raggedly like forest dogs, as if laboring with some anxiety or seeking expression. Sometimes one came near to my window, attracted by my light, barked a vulpine curse at me, then retreated. Usually, the red squirrel waked me in the dawn, coursing over the roof and up and down the sides of the house, as if sent to the woods for this purpose. In the course of the winter, I threw out half a bushel of ears of sweet corn which had not got ripe onto the snow crust by my door, and was amused by watching the motions of the various animals which were baited by it. In the twilight and the night, the rabbits came regularly and made a hearty meal. All day long, the red squirrels came and went and afforded me much entertainment by their maneuvers. One would approach, at first warily, through the shrub oaks, running over the snow crust by fits and starts like a leaf blown by the wind, now a few paces this way, with wonderful speed and waste of energy, and now as many paces that way, but never getting on more than half a rod at a time. Then suddenly he would pause with a ludicrous expression and a gratuitous somersault, as if all the eyes in the universe were fixed on him. I never saw one. And then, suddenly, before you could say Jack Robinson, he would be in the top of a young pitch pine, winding up his clock and chiding all imaginary specters, soliloquizing and talking to all the universe at the same time, and this for no reason that I could ever detect, or that probably he himself was aware of, I suspect. Finally, he would reach the corn, and selecting a suitable ear, frisk about in the same uncertain trigonometrical way to the topmost stick of my woodpile beside my window, where he looked me in the face, and there sit for hours, supplying himself with a new ear from time to time, nibbling at first voraciously and then throwing the half-naked cobs about. At length, he grew more dainty still and played with his food, tasting only the inside of the kernel. The ear, which was held balanced by one paw, slipped from his careless grasp and fell to the ground, and he would look over at it with a ludicrous expression of uncertainty, as if suspecting that it had life, with a mind not made up whether to get it again or a new one or be off away somewhere else. He would stop, now thinking of corn, then listening to hear what was in the wind. So the little impudent fellow would waste many an ear of corn in a fore-afternoon. At last, seizing some longer and plumper one considerably bigger than himself and skillfully balancing it, he would set out with it to the woods, like a tiger with a buffalo, by the same zigzag course and frequent pauses, scratching along with it as if it were way too heavy for him, and all the while being determined to get it home. I would afterward find the cobs strewn about the woods in various directions. Eventually the jays would come. Their discordant screams could be heard long before their arrival. They warily made their approach, and in a stealthy and sneaking manner they would flit from tree to tree, nearer and nearer, and pick up the kernels which the squirrels had dropped. Then, sitting on a pitch pine bough, they might attempt to swallow a kernel which is too big for their throats, and after great labor disgorge it and spend an hour in the endeavor to crack it with repeated blows with their bills. They were manifestly thieves, but the squirrels, though at first shy, went to work as if they were taking what was their own. Meanwhile, also came the chickadees in flocks, which, picking up the crumbs the squirrels had dropped, flew to the nearest twig, and placing them under their claws, hammered away at them with their little bills, as if they were an insect in the bark, till the kernel was sufficiently reduced for their slender throats. A little flock of these came daily to pick a dinner out of my woodpile, or the crumbs at my door, with faint flitting lisping notes, like the tinkling of icicles in the grass. They were so familiar that at length one alighted on an armful of wood which I was carrying in, and pecking at the sticks without fear. I once had a sparrow alight upon my shoulder for a moment while I was hoeing in a garden, and I felt that I was more distinguished by that circumstance than I should have been by any epaulet I could have worn. The squirrels also grew at last to be quite familiar, and occasionally stepped upon my shoe when that was the nearest way. When the ground was not quite yet covered, and again near the end of winter, when the snow was melted on my south hillside and about my woodpile, the partridges came out of the woods morning and evening to feed there. Whichever side you walk in the woods, the partridge bursts away on whirring rings, jarring the snow from the dry leaves and twigs on high, which comes sifting down in the sunbeams like golden dust. This brave bird is not to be scared by winter. It is frequently covered up by drifts and sometimes plunges from on wing into the soft snow, where it remains concealed for a day or two. I used to startle them in the open land also, where they had come out of the woods at sunset to eat the buds off the wild apple trees. They will come regularly every evening to particular trees. Squirrels and wild mice disputed for my store of nuts. There were scores of pitch pines around my house from 1 to 4 inches in diameter, which had been gnawed by mice the previous winter, a heavy winter for them, because the snow lay long and deep, and they were obliged to mix a large proportion of pine bark with their other diet. These trees were alive and apparently flourishing at midsummer, and many of them had grown a foot, though completely girdled. But after another winter, most of the gnawed, girdled trees were dead. It is remarkable that a single mouse should thus be allowed a whole pine tree for its dinner, gnawing round instead of up and down it. But perhaps it is necessary in order to thin these trees, which have a tendency to grow up densely. The hares were very familiar. One had her form under my house all winter, separated from me only by the flooring, and she startled me each morning by her hasty departure when I began to stir. Thump, 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 striking her head against the floor timbers in her hurry. They would come round my door at dusk to nibble on the potato parings which I had thrown out, and which were so nearly the color of the ground that they could hardly be distinguished when still. Sometimes, in the twilight, I alternately lost and recovered sight of one sitting motionless under my window. When I opened my door in the evening, off they would go with a squeak and a bounce. One evening, one sat by my door 2 paces from me, at first trembling with fear, yet unwilling to move. A poor wee thing, lean and bony, with ragged ears and a sharp nose, scant tail and slender paws. I took a step, and lo, away it ran with an elastic spring over the snow crust, straightening its body and its limbs into a graceful length, and very soon put the forest between me and itself, the wild, free denizen, asserting its vigor and the dignity of nature. What is a country without rabbits and partridges? They are among the most simple and indigenous animal citizens. Ancient and venerable families known to antiquity as to modern times, of the very hue and substance of nature, nearest allied to leaves and to the ground and to one another. It is hardly as if you had seen a wild creature when a rabbit or a partridge bursts away, only a natural one, as much to be expected as the rustling of leaves. The partridge and the rabbit are still sure to thrive like true natives of the soil, whatever revolutions occur. If the forest is cut off, the sprouts and bushes which spring up afford them concealment, and they become more numerous than ever. That must be a poor country indeed that does not support a hare. Our woods teem with them both. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales with Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Endorsed by Wolfgang Beastly. Produced by GWC Productions. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.